Douglas, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So we all know FDR's immense legacy on the economy, international affairs, and I assume I'm not that atypical. When you read this, you see how deeply committed he was to the environment. Why did this matter so much to FDR?
Because it mattered to Theodore Roosevelt a lot, and everything FDR did, he modeled himself after TR. That was one big thing, but also he was born along the Hudson River, and that whole Hudson River Valley is storied in American history. It's a sanctified landscape, and a lot of our early conservation principles come from there. I mean, he was a boy that was engaged with protection of the Catskills, the Adirondacks wilderness for forever.
I worked at Grosinger, so I know the Catskills.
Yes. Okay. Well, and so that he always represented upstate New York. I think a mistake when we say FDR, New York, everybody thinks it's the city, but he really represented the farmers, the foresters, the outdoor recreationists in that part. So it came quite naturally to him, both by family and topography.
Give us the Cliff Notes version of his greatest accomplishments. What are his major environmental conservation deeds?
Well, as president, 1933 to 1942, the Civilian Conservation Corps planted nearly 3 billion trees, across America. People think about the Great Depression, they think the stock market crashed, but our whole country was denuded. We had to do massive reforestation. We had to combat the Dust Bowl and soil erosion. So we put these unemployed men, paid them $1 a day, and had them go to national parks and
3 million of them, right?
Yep, 3.4 million eventually go through the CCC, and they've created this beautiful outdoor recreation infrastructure, whether it's Red Rocks Amphitheater in Colorado or ski slope lodges in Vermont. On and on. It was I think the most successful of the New Deal programs.
You know, I'm so glad you started with that, because the tension we have today, I know, existed in his administration. You're either for economic health or you're for environmental health, but he believed they were interdependent. Is that not so?
Completely. It's crucial to him. In any big public works project he'd do, like the Tennessee Valley Authority to electrify the rural South, there would also be a conservation component to it, an outdoor recreation area, something adjacent to it. He constantly wanted to play the balance. Now, his heart was as a wilderness protector, and he was a big believer in the National Park Service. He went to Glacier and famously did a radio broadcast from way up there in Montana and said there's nothing more American than the national parks. And he went on to say places like the Great Smokies and Everglades, Big Bend, Joshua Tree, the Olympics, Jackson Hole, Mammoth Cave, Isle Royal. I could go on and on and on. And at the back of my book, I list all the great places he saved in America.
Did the American people get the interdependency? Because that's another great tension in America in 2016, not only between the parties, but between the electorate. Did they get it?
Rural people seemed to get it because all the ducks and geese were gone. And so on one hand, they wanted roads, they wanted construction projects. On the other hand, they wanted their way of life back. They wanted to be able to have streams that had fish in it. They wanted lakes they could swim in. And Roosevelt was a big believer in outdoor recreation, and yet also as the person who gives us the Grand Coulee Dam and the Golden Gate Bridge and all of this. So he would say that they have to go in tandem. You have to do both.
Well, it wasn't just dams. I mean, you mentioned farms a minute ago. The farm subsidy program was another thing that sort of ran counter to his environmental core, did it not?
There's a lot. And look, I can praise the CCC to holy heaven, but they also planted kudzu in the South, which grows wild, and they misplanted cottonwood trees where they shouldn't. There were errors made. But it turned a group of young urban Americans with no future, and it told them, care about the land. You are the land steward. And wherever Franklin Roosevelt did, he wanted to see land managed properly. It was his #1 pet peeve. I've even discovered letters he wrote to like the Shah of Iran after going there for Tehran and conferences and during the World War II, and he writes, I've been here, your region, and boy, you have soil erosion problems. Let me fix it for you. We could do tree planting. FDR would always put on occupation tree grower or tree farmer because he ran a tree plantation on the Hudson, and also Warm Springs, Georgia was a tree plantation where he created a retreat for people with polio.
Wilderness Warrior, speaking of Teddy Roosevelt, was your great book on Teddy Roosevelt. How did they compare in terms of their approach to preserving and actually expanding environmental protection?
They're very similar in some regards, but Theodore Roosevelt was a writer, and he loved to write himself into his his narrative, his travels. And so if he goes to the Amazon, he writes a book about the Brazilian wilderness, Theodore Roosevelt. Well, FDR, as I write in my book, 1938, goes to the Galapagos and disappears for weeks as president, following in the footsteps of Darwin, but he doesn't write a word about it. In fact, he wants it kind of quiet. I was able to find this archive of Dr. Waldo Schmidt at the Smithsonian that had diaries and recreate that trip. So that's one difference, publicizing themselves via writing. But a bigger thing is he liked exploration. And loved, going, he liked big monumental things, Theodore Roosevelt, Yellowstone and Yosemite. FDR was more backyard naturalism. Have a vegetable garden, take care of the birds at the bird feeder, keep your local rivers clean. He wasn't quite as grandiose, and also about regulation. By the time of the 1930s, what FDR is basically doing is saying we need an EPA. We don't get the Environmental Protection Agency to 1970, but the mechanisms are coming into place during the New Deal sewage treatment and things that aren't as exciting as, saving buffalo, but they're just as important, more important in many ways. Just sewage treatment alone doesn't get covered, but I mean, gosh, is that a big topic.
Is he the greatest environmental president? And before you answer, there have been a ton of pieces, I'd say in the last 6 months, saying the greatest environmental president is the current one. Not because he's passed any laws, because I don't think he has, but people say his interpretation of the Clean Water Act of 1970, I think it was, and the executive actions he's taken has made more progress on the environmental front than anybody. Who's number one, and how do the two compare?
Well, I put on the very top Franklin Roosevelt and Theodore. They're different ways, but they're almost in a league unto themselves, because they put environment, conservation, whatever you want to call it, as the number one priority of their presidencies over and over and over again. Barack Obama, Jimmy Carter, Lyndon and Johnson have been very strong, and in Obama's case, his fight on climate change and reducing, emissions and from fossil fuels, on that, he is an environmental president. I give him high marks, but not in the same degree as FDR and Theodore Roosevelt.
You ever been to Cape Cod?
I have.
Don't leave JFK out of the national seashore, my friend.
That's a very beautiful. I'm very, and also he did South Padre Island, Texas national seashore, and Point Reyes, California. So Kennedy was good too.
So I don't know how humble a guy you are, but if they're the two greatest environmental presidents, it's pretty clear you're the greatest environmental historian. You don't have to answer that, because I know what you'll say. Why? You've written a lot, not just the two, Roosevelt's, Alaska. I mean, a whole bunch of. What's with you and the environment? Well,
when I was a boy, my mother and father were teachers. We had a trailer, and we'd go all over the country. So by the time I was 18, I got to go to most of the national parks. So I got the bug. I now have 3 kids of my own, and I get to do research trips to, come on, kids, we're going to Joshua Tree, and I go to the archive, or go to Shenandoah National Park, and I do research while we spend days there. So I love the like baseball and jazz. I mean, there's nothing more American than the national parks, and the sense of, when I think of America the Beautiful, my national anthems, Woody Guthrie's "This Land Is Your Land," and that kind of celebration of our natural features.
Let's fast forward for a second. Do you see any FDR in any of the 3 people left standing?
Well, that's I would say no. But he liked to do big things, FDR,
Like Donald Trump?
Well, there's a little bit of that grandiosity that's there. I mean, Stalin once said that Churchill will negotiate with you and try to sneak his hand and grab a coin, where that FDR just comes right up to you, sticks both hands in, and pulls everything out. And so both Roosevelts, TR and FDR, there's a little of that narcissistic kind of personality of grandiosity, wherever those words meet, that you see a little bit in Trump, but that's about it. I mean, FDR was about the people, he was a democratic socialist. His philosophy was closer to Bernie Sanders than even, Hillary Clinton, or and certainly compared to Donald Trump.
What's the closest you've seen in American history to the Trump phenomenon of 2016?
I compare it to people like Huey Long on a smaller scale, because Long would do chicken in every pot and promise lower middle class all these gifts, types of things their whole lives are going to change, but also did it with a kind of panache and humor. George Wallace, there's kind of a racist kind of card that you see Trump play. The Ross Perot syndrome of, I'm a billionaire and can self-finance myself. And remember, Perot got 19% of the vote on the sucking sound you hear are jobs leaving the country, meaning anti-NAFTA. And if Trump is able to win, it's going to be because of the Midwest turning on NAFTA.
Yeah, does Trumpism, whatever it is, survive? Let's assume Trump is not elected president. Does it survive the Trump candidacy?
No.
These kinds of things you just described, you don't think
I think
survive?
it'll survive because you may be seeing the last gasp of white male America, a sense of privilege and a prerogative kind of shrinking. This may be a spasm here. I don't think there's this Trumpism is, if it doesn't work with Donald Trump this time around, I think it will shrink as being a fringe part of the Republican Party or, libertarian movement.
I see a lot on CNN, and John King with the Magic Wall does this masterful work where he describes, well, Trump is more favored by 5% on the economy, but when you go to those industrial Rust Belt states in the Midwest, he's favored by 25 points on the economy. If he can win them, and maybe Florida, says the master of the Electoral College, John King, he can be president. Can he be president?
Yes, he can. I would not underestimate Trump's position right now at all, because I'm from Ohio, and a lot of people there are ready to vote for Trump. And if Trump can grab Ohio and Michigan and maybe put Pennsylvania in play, it's going to be close. We have red states, blue states, and it's right back to these 6 swing states or so. But I think it's all about those Midwest, and Trump's polling fairly well there.
One last thing about current politics, which isn't about politicians, about the press. Your great book about Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, even though I have to say there's some ethical lapses that I never knew about until I read your book. Could Walter Cronkite exist in 2016?
On PBS, on something, on NPR, but he's not of this ilk of entertainment bleeding into news and hyping 24/7. That wasn't his style.
Why was he the most trusted man in America?
Because he triple sourced everything. He never broke news that wasn't right. He didn't have to do a lot of retraction. He also didn't show favoritism. He kind of did straight balls
for LBJ,
down the middle.
he showed a little favoritism,
that's when
as
it
you said.
broke, by 68, up until that point. And then the people, he was a leader in the anti-war movement inadvertently. But I think people just like the cut of his jib, and the kind of the Midwest steadiness. In movies, you can go see a George Clooney movie and say, I didn't like it, and then not have to live with Clooney for a year. But with television, you come in every day, and so you have to wear well on people, and Cronkite knew how to break through the glass and seemed to be a family member, Uncle Walter.
Let's end where we began, Douglas Brinkley. What's the moral of the story from FDR for policymakers in 2016?
Well, on my book is that the environment matters. It's everything. That's our inheritance, the public lands. We have to protect them. We got to keep our rivers clean. We can't gouge them every time there's a recession. And there's in the western states, we saw a takeover of a wildlife refuge by a Yahoo. And so we've got to learn to treasure our over 550 national wildlife refuge, and thank people that work for the National Park Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife and state parks and people that do historical, preservation work. These are great American citizens, and we've got to learn, I think, to say thanks to all of them.
Another great book, Douglas Brinkley.
Thank
Great
you.
to see you. Thank you so much.